The demand to supply ratio, or DSR for short, is a measure of demand relative to supply in a property market. One of the most fundamental laws of economics is that prices rise when demand exceeds supply. If we can gauge supply and we can gauge demand, then we can gauge the pressure on property prices to rise. In other words, we can predict capital growth. Now, to gauge demand relative to supply, the DSR considers many indicators of either supply or demand, and it combines them all together into a single score out of 100. The higher the score, the more demand exceeds supply, and therefore the more pressure there is to push prices higher. A DSR score of 50 out of 100 is the theoretical balance point between supply and demand. Areas that have a DSR around 50 would not be expected to have much capital growth, at least not in the short term anyway, not until they get out of balance again at some time in the future. A DSR score of 50 is quite common, and that's because supply and demand are constantly working to maintain balance. But sometimes markets get out of balance, and as investors, we want to target those imbalanced areas, imbalanced where demand exceeds supply. And these areas will have DSR scores well above the average, and we definitely want to avoid those areas with a DSR well below the average. So does the DSR really work? Yes, it does. It's not faultless, but it has done a pretty good job beating a lot of the popular industry experts over the years. It's not easy to explain in a single sentence or even in a small paragraph just how well the DSR has performed, which is why we've put together a comprehensive report on that topic. And that report will be updated regularly, which is not the case for this video. So I'll leave that topic to the DSR Historical Performance Report. Now, some investors express concern that the DSR identifies markets that they say are already hot or that are too hot. Now, the term too hot implies there is a point when demand exceeds supply to such an extent that the fundamental laws of economics suddenly invert. Now, this is of course not true. However, investors will find it difficult to buy in a market with a very high DSR. It takes a lot of effort to get great results. The alternative is to buy in a market with a low DSR, and these are very easy to buy into. The problem is you may not experience positive capital growth for many years. So head towards the heat, steer clear of the cold. Now, another question you might wonder is the DSR reliable? Overall, yes, but far from perfect. The DSR uses a number of statistics to draw its conclusion. A single anomaly in any one statistic can't spill over to spoil the overall DSR score for a suburb. But some markets are a bit sparse on data, so be sure to check the statistical reliability figure. It's a measure of how reliable the DSR is for the market being scored. And you might find that sometimes the DSR for a suburb can go up and down from month to month and by significant amounts. So make sure you check the historical chart for volatility. It could be that the latest DSR for a suburb was a one-off high. So what is a good score for the DSR? Whenever you are wondering about what a good or bad value is for any metric, the answer is always in the context ruler. Open a context ruler for that metric and it will show you the average value, the median, and the usual range of values for that metric. The context ruler will show how rare or how common a value is. All right, why is the DSR such a big deal? So firstly, it gives us a gauge of growth potential. When most investors have no idea about future growth potential, that alone makes the DSR extremely valuable. And it's all the more important when you realise that the difference between good and ordinary capital growth is measured in the tens, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Secondly, the DSR is objective. It's not opinionated or biased, and it's consistent. The same algorithm is applied for all markets Australia-wide, so we can compare a suburb in Perth to a suburb in Sydney using the same yardstick. And it's numerical, meaning we know by how much one suburb is better than another. And it's also easy, given everyone's familiarity with scores between 0 and 100. And it is tremendously convenient, given it is countrywide. it's impossible to manually examine thousands of suburbs around Australia. The DSR crunches all the numbers for you. Note that the DSR is not just another variable. It is not a different measure of supply or demand. It is an overall measure. It is a combination of all other measures. For example, you don't check that a suburb has a good vacancy rate and a good days on market as well as a good DSR. The DSR is a combination of all the other indicators. It is not just another one, it's the one. And you don't need to examine all the metrics that the DSR is derived from either. The whole idea behind the DSR is so investors wouldn't have to do that. And if you did try that, you might get it wrong and undo the hard work of the algorithm. Use the DSR as a shortlisting tool to get you in the right ballpark. Once you have a small set of candidate suburbs with high DSRs, you can then do whatever other research you want, but at least you've got some hot leads to start with.